So welcome to tonight's webinar, Strategically Planning Your Triathlon Season for Success, with David Glover and Krista Schultz. So I'm David, and I'm going to introduce Krista real quickly. Krista has been a triathlete for more than a decade. She's qualified and competed at the Ironman World Championships in Hawaii, and also placed in her age group at the inaugural Ironman China. She represented the state of Maryland for the Best of the U.S. from 2006 to 2008. Her background: she ran Division I track at University of New Orleans. She has her Bachelor's of Science in Exercise Physiology from UNO and a Master's in Education from Goucher College. She's certified by USA Cycling, USA Triathlon, and the National Strength and Conditioning Association for both CSCS, which is Certified Strength and Conditioning Specialist, and Certified Personal Trainer. Krista is the founder of She Does Try Triathlon Programs for Women.
Thanks, David. I'll give you a little information on David. He's, in addition to being my husband, he's a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy. He has a Master's in Exercise Physiology. He's also a former professional triathlete. His personal best for Ironman is 8:51, so 8 hours, 51 minutes. He's done 28 Ironman distance events. And Ironman Hawaii World Championships is included in that. He is the founder of the Luray Triathlons and the School of Tri. Also author of the book called Full Time and Sub 9. And David also holds certifications in USA Cycling, USA Triathlete, and he's a certified strength and conditioning specialist.
So, such a nebulous topic, planning. And there's a lot of great quotes out there. This is just one I found the other day. A dream is just a dream. A goal is a dream with a plan and a deadline. So, a lot of us have dreams, and I know for me as a child, one of them was to one day do the Ironman race, and it took me a long time to get there. I guess it was probably about 20 years from the time I first saw the race to the time I actually did one. And there was it took part of that was the process of coming up with that plan, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So why take the time to plan? And at the beginning of the year, January, early February, is sort of the perfect time to kind of figure out what you want to do this year. And at the end of the day, it's about achieving your goals and doing it the best possible way.
Yep. So one of the things that I recently did is laid out a run plan for myself personally, and it was interesting how just writing it down, I was talking to David about this, sort of planning out these progressions and writing it down and following it from week to week, how more successful I was able to be. So there is a lot to that, and thinking, oh, I really want to do this, or liking the idea of something is one thing, but making it a reality and putting it on paper and following it, that's really what leads you to that success.
Yep. So we're going to kind of walk you through some examples that you can actually use in terms of starting with what is it you're trying to accomplish. So what is your goal, and then kind of backing up from there. So what are the pieces you need to put in place to get there? Starting, so for example, if your goal is an Ironman, or maybe it's even to do your first triathlon, what are the things you need to think about along the way? So what is that process? So that's what we're going to hit on tonight. So at the end of the day, I mean, if you've done any number of triathlons or even running races, they take time. I mean, and commitment. At the end of the day, the more you do, the more training, the more races, the longer race season, you want to improve performance, develop new skills, the more time it takes. And interestingly enough, any of these apply to anything. So for me, for example, last year I started doing martial arts for the first time, and a lot of these principles we're going to talk about tonight apply there. They could apply to your job. They could apply to just your personal growth.
Yeah, and training is racing, racing's training, testing is training, training's testing, but there are specific categories, especially when you get into longer racing and prioritizing all these things and, you know, making it work really well for your body so you can do well and feel good, you know, and enjoy the sport. So we're going to get more specific on a lot of these, you know, a lot of these different things David has outlined here.
So one of the first, probably the most important question you can ask yourself now, if you haven't done so already, you know, is why? You know, why are you here? You know, why are you at this webinar? You know, why are you doing triathlons? Why are you doing marathons? And at the end of the day, you know, it's the answer to it will also maybe an indication of your level of commitment. And I like this graph and I use it a lot, but if you think of commitment as sort of a continuum, you know, starting at the left, so with wish, you know, sort of kind of a weak level commitment, sort of like a dream, and then you kind of go up a little bit more to hope, then like, try, want, and commit. So, you know, sort of the right side of the graph is sort of that high level commitment, the left side is the lower level. And you know, what I found, and I've seen this in a lot of, you know, Chris and I both worked with hundreds of athletes over the years, and, you know, from coaching to, you know, just, you know, for me being a race director to putting on camps and clinics, is we're all going to fall somewhere along this line of commitment, and it may change. It may change from year to year. It may change from day to day. But it's important is to really figure out, okay, where do you fall, and are you, you know, how committed are you to getting to what you want to accomplish?
Yeah, and it's really important to sit down and maybe write down your priorities. I like to have a lot of clients I coach, or do this for myself as well, because priorities tend to change. You know, typically we have the same priorities, you know, from day to day, week to week, year to year. But a lot of times there's a shift in those things, especially if we're training for, you know, for example, an Ironman, because there are certain points in that training program where you have to make a really large commitment, and that might be something you want to discuss with family, even friends, and, you know, sort of write it down and go back to it. What are my top 3, top 5 priorities right now? And that will help you with determining where you are on that commitment continuum for whatever, you know, goal it is, an Ironman, or you know, just training for a specific event.
Yeah, it's really easy, and one of the biggest, I was thinking of calling the deadly sins, but one of the biggest deadly sins I see, especially in triathlon, is just overcommitting. So, you know, trying to do too much and not really having that, you know, that support system in place, or having, you know, basically by committing to doing one thing, it means you're not committing to do something else. So just something to think about, and any of this stuff, it helps to write down. You know, we'll talk a little bit more about goals in a second. So where to begin, and you know, it's the best place I think for this sport is to, you know, begin at the end. So what do you want to accomplish this year? You know, what do you want to accomplish a few years from now? Because at the end of the day, and you know, this is another great quote: if you don't know where you're going, you'll probably end up somewhere else. So really, by defining what you want to do this year, so I'll use Chris as an example. So I know she wants to do Barb's race, which is a half Ironman. So that's a good endpoint. Okay, so if that race is in July, how does she get there?
Yeah, and something really, really important is to remember what you want and your specific goals. I find it very easy, especially for myself, to sort of jump on the bandwagon of, you know, what other people are doing, and sometimes it might not fit, sometimes it might. So you want to consider that. You know, it gets exciting when other people are doing things, especially maybe some hard training workouts, or, you know, an event that may or may not fit into your plan. So don't make someone else's plan or don't let that interfere with your own plan. Consider, if that fits for you.
So what are your goals? And again, we talked about to get to your goals, you sort of need that plan. But when we think about goals, we can kind of think about different types of goals. So the outcome goal, that's probably the most obvious type. So that's the gold medal. That's the PR. I'm going to get my personal best time. That's finishing the race. Okay, I'm going to do my first sprint triathlon. So that's something you can measure. It's tangible. It's basically something you can see in the results. But there's other types of goals that are equally as important. Learning, real quick, you can see there's Krista after Columbia Triathlon one year. She's really happy. So I know she didn't have a PR that year, but I know she had a good race. So she learned something during that race. Maybe it was I think in that case it was good pacing, or it was nailing her nutrition. So there's independent of the outcome. So she didn't have the best the fastest race that year. She got something out of it. So there was that sense of achievement. And then finally the sort of what we're talking about today, we're talking about planning. So this is your process goals. So that's your stepping stone. So if we define that endpoint of for Krista, I'm going to do Barb's race in July. For another athlete, it might be I'm going to do my first sprint triathlon. What are those steps to get to that end goal?
Yeah, I think the learning goals are really important. I've actually worked with people on trying to develop those a little bit more and not being so outcome focused on a place or a time. Rather, I learned how to pace, like David said, or learned how to nail my nutrition, and I feel good about accomplishing that goal because that is a process goal. It's sort of a stepping stone in the big picture. So that gets you even closer to, your main goal, which is, for a lot of us, improving in the sport or getting faster and more efficient.
Yeah, another example, just, for me, for a long time when I was doing Ironman races, I kept getting sick on the bike. So about 80 miles into it, and 85 miles, I would vomit. And it took me a few races to figure it out, but I was basically, what was I doing? I was basically taking in, too many carbohydrates. There's too much sports drink and too many gels. So that was a valuable lesson, which ultimately, fed into outcome goals, a faster outcome goal as well. So process goals. The path from A to Z. So your plan, and when we sit down and we look at a client schedule, or Krista mentioned our own schedule. We really like the weekly view. So what are you doing from week to week? And when you map this out, and one thing I'll do, and I did this for the two of us as a couple the other day, where we said, okay, let's print out a calendar for the whole year, and week by week just kind of go through and what are the key events. Okay, we know that there's a half marathon in Illinois we're going to in June. We got Barb's race in July. What are those other events? Krista's brother's getting married. Those are the the kind of the key things that are going on this year, and that's sort of the starting point of, okay, now where do I how do I build my schedule around that? What are the key focus areas? So the common term you hear is limiters. So what's if you don't if you're just learning how to swim, swimming is probably a limiter for you. So what can you do to focus on that to get faster in the water? Now this time of year, it's a great time to take lessons. So Chris and I have both been I've been a competitive triathlete for over 20 years now, and Krista probably close to 15. But both of us took a lesson a week or two ago, just to kind of, okay, let's look at what we're doing, get some feedback, and how do we get that much more efficient in the water. So it's important to map that out, and what I'll do is I'll go into I've got a Max. I'll go into iCalendar, print out a blank schedule each month, and just kind of jot down these things, and kind of focus in on, okay, here's the events, here's the types of things I want to focus on. in Boulder right now, the weather's hit or miss. I mean, we got about 5 inches of snow yesterday, but today was sunny and it was mostly melted on the road. So it's hard to plan bike rides. And plus the wind. So it's okay. Now's a good time to focus on swimming, or maybe okay, I can do indoor workouts. So what are those other factors that are driving what you can do, and what's a good thing to focus on?
Yeah, and just to back up briefly what David said about sitting down and kind of reviewing our yearly plan, it wasn't only race events, but we talked about vacation or weddings, and those kind of things are important for you to discuss with your coach, or at least have sort of mapped out, because if you're training for a big event and you have some big training weeks, what I like to do a lot of times is on vacations or periods of time where someone will be away, not have access or time to training, is make that a recovery week. So trying to plan that into the big picture so you don't get stuck thinking or feeling bad about not doing your training properly.
Yeah, and the reality may be there may be things it just doesn't make sense to do this year. So if you've got a family wedding, then you got vacation, and then you're going to be on travel for a couple of weeks for work. After that, it's probably not a good time to schedule a big race. So it's really figuring out, okay, what makes sense, and that's the end of the day. What makes sense. So choosing races, chances are you've probably already picked some races for the year. Some of the factors, if you're looking at other races, things to think about, and Chris had mentioned, it's easy just to kind of jump on what everyone else is doing. I know for a while there, whenever there was a new Ironman, I wanted to do it, regardless of where it was. But some things to think about, time of year, what, not only when the race is, but where you are relative to that. So if you're gonna, had a friend in Tom, who was doing Ironman New Zealand a few years back. Well, he lives in Washington D.C., so that race is in March. So he had to do his long bike rides over the winter, and it was a pretty bad winter. So I remember him saying he'll never do that again, just because having to ride indoors on a trainer for 4 or 5 hours was not his cup of tea. So things to think about. Swim start. If you're new to the sport, you may want to look at pool swims. Or if you're just not super comfortable with open water, looking for the small waves versus the mass waves of some of the larger races. Race size, again, comfort level. I've sort of been a big fan of the independent Ironman races. They tend to be smaller. That's actually a picture from Vineman. But to me, they're more intimate, more personal, because you're a person, or the race announcers can announce your name versus just being another number. But with the big races, you sort of get that big production, that the jumbotrons and the media and stuff too. So it's what appeals to you.
Yeah, and with that, I mean, if you're trying to qualify for particular events, that's something to consider when picking a race, of course.
Yep. Course. What do you have accessible to where you are today? So if you live in flat, it may be tough to train for a race on a really hilly course. Just something to think about. Locale. So what's there when you go there? If you're traveling with family and friends, going to Los Cabos, Mexico is a great place to bring your significant other. Bringing your family to Coeur d'Alene. There's outdoors stuff. It's a pretty area. Things like that. Things. What's there. Training partners. Again, going back to the example of my friend Tom, when he was training for New Zealand a few years ago, there's no one else in the area that I know of that could train with him. So he's doing all those workouts by himself. The advantage of jumping on the bandwagon with your friends is that a lot of times you have someone to train with. Weather, great example. Lake Tahoe, beautiful area. You know, I've been there a few years ago and for skiing, and I remember thinking, gosh, what a beautiful area to have a race. The challenge there may be, you know, it snows, you know, on race day as it did that first year. Budget. So, you know, at the end of the day, the bigger the race, the further you travel, you know, obviously the more expensive it is.
Yeah, and if you have to travel with your bike and you've never traveled with your bike before, that's something you might want to look into. There are companies that will take care of all that for you. Then, you know, the other thing is you could ship it, you could bring it on the plane, you could rent a bike. So you want to consider those things and determine, you know, if that's going to be a reasonable cost or avenue for you.
Yeah, and I forget the specifics. I know Southwest, it's if you bring a bike, you know, in baggage, it's $75 each way. I think that's on the low end. Frontier might be $50 or $75. In the past, I know Delta has been like $200. So just, you know, something to think about, or just to check into.
And you might get lucky and they might not charge you, but that rarely happens. I think that's happened to me a couple times.
Yeah. So one of the questions you get a lot is, you think about, okay, you've kind of picked this big event, or, you know, maybe it's a small event out in the future. Is what do you do to get to them? So what are the stepping stones? And, you know, one of the things I always recommend, you know, if you're going for a longer race, like a half or a full Ironman, or even a, you know, half or full marathon, is do some shorter races leading up to it. You know, it's a great way, you know, to kind of get your feet wet again in the new year, kind of get back in that mindset of, okay, this is what I need to do. It tends to be a great training session, and it can kind of give you a status of how your training is going so far, where your fitness level is. So here's some just general guidelines. So if I look on the left, my race type, these would be triathlon examples. Weeks until the next race. So if I'm doing a sprint, I could really do back-to-back sprints. I probably don't want to. You know, good rule of thumb I like to use is, you know, about one race a month. You know, from May to say September, October. You know, and that might be a run, it might be a triathlon. And generally, as this shows, the longer you go. So if I'm doing an international, I probably won't want to do another race for at least a couple weeks. If I'm doing a half Ironman, you know, maybe as a lead up to a full, I sort of like that 5 to 8 week window before doing the full. And then if you're doing a full, yeah, I'd recommend no more than 2 a year. There's a couple of years I did 3, and I guess at the end of the day I got slower each one. So as the season went on, so and it just ended up being too much. But so just some general guidelines. So if you're going from sprint to international, you know, you can space them 1 to 4 weeks or longer. International half 2 to 5, and so on.
Yeah, and this is a great slide. I encourage everyone, if they haven't looked at their goal events, distances, and where they're spaced out, is to just kind of see if you fall in these ranges. And if you know you do well with racing more closer together, that's one thing. But, you know, typically if you space it out like this, you'll have a lot more success. You'll be fresher for events. And then to break this down even further, for shorter events or single sport events, utilizing them as training events within, you know, some of these ranges is a great idea. And the way that you utilize them as training events is when you're planning your scheduling every month or cycle, you wouldn't allow for rest for those, you know, shorter sport-specific events. For example, maybe a 5K or a half marathon. So looking at the big picture first, spreading the major events out accordingly, and then kind of breaking it down even further. Hopefully that made sense.
So here's an example of a race timeline. And again, if we were planning this out, and this is I've got an extra race at the bottom there. So, you know, again, probably look at a week-over-week view, so print out a calendar. So ignore the plus 3 weeks in the A2 Ironman Boulder at the end. So that I meant to delete that. But if you kind of look at the schedule, it starts May 16th with a sprint, and then 3 weeks later, again, so looking for that, you know, we said sprints, we could do them close together. You know, 3 weeks later, doing a half marathon, and then, you know, that 5 to 8 week window for a half marathon. So 5 weeks to the Boulder Peak International, and then you know, 2 weeks to Krista's goal race of Barb's race.
Yeah, the schedule looks really familiar.
Yeah.
So this is kind of my plan for 2015.
Yep. So that's just kind of that, you know, applying those guidelines from before. And again, ignore the stuff on the bottom. I forgot to delete that. And I guess one more comment on this. If you kind of look, it actually works out about roughly one race a month. So July there's 2, but you know, if you go from May and you assume your season's going to, you know, be over in July, you know, it's roughly, you know, those four races, May, June, July, you know, through beginning of August. So we kind of talked about laying out those stepping stones, or, you know, what are the big picture, you know, you defined where you're trying to get to, and kind of laying out, okay, here's some things I need to do along the way. So let's kind of fill in the details a little bit. As you know, if you were to create your own plan from week to week, what might it look like, and what things do you want to think about? So we want to talk about the specificity of training, and basically the specificity of training means that in order to go faster in a triathlon, you have to train for a triathlon. So you have to swim, bike, and run. You know, you have to do those things, and you know, you can, you know, do cross-country skiing. It's great for your off-season fitness, but it may not necessarily make you a faster runner. So if you kind of break down the year into pieces, it might look like this. So sort of we've got the off-season, which is, you know, a lot of us are just coming off of. So, you know, sort of the end of last season to the start of the next. Early season, it's probably where most folks on this call are. So you're just starting to, you know, think about training, put you know, a plan in place. In season, what I'll call the racing season. So for Krista, that's sort of that May, June, July, August time frame, and then you know, race, which would be, you know, very specific to the race.
So this is the general adaptation syndrome. So it's very, very important piece of knowledge, physiology here. And this is how our bodies get fitter, how they respond to training. So first we have the alarm phase, which is, okay, I'm training, I'm riding my bike, I'm doing intervals, and then we start through the resistance and build the body up. So we're going longer, we're doing longer rides, longer runs, we're building, you know, mileage, we're building intensity in our programs. Then what we want to do before we get to that last phase is recover. And this is probably the most important part of triathlon training, but one of the things that I think is missed a lot of times in the big picture planning is taking those recovery periods. And why is that? It's because exercise in general is stress. So stress is just breaking down our bodies, breaking down muscles, bones. But what happens when we do recover, when we take that recovery phase and avoid that downward fall there, we avoid exhaustion because our bodies are allowed to build back up. So just remember this when you're doing a lot of racing, doing a lot of training. Do you have periods of downtime where you can recover, even if it's a few days? You know, there's a lot of different formats we can follow to incorporate that rest period. And it's, it's different for everybody depending on what events they're doing, what they've done from year to year. I have a client that I worked with last year that did Ironman Lake Placid, and she's doing another Ironman this year. And her preparation phase this year is a lot shorter than it was last year because she's maintained some fitness, but she's fitter this year. So we don't need as much lower volume at the beginning. She can recover faster. So I'm considering that in her when I look at her big picture plan. So, if you think about going into the weight room and you're pushing the leg press and you go in there from day to day and you increase the weight each time, there's a certain point you'll get to with that leg press that you won't be able to push that same amount of weight. You'll actually fatigue. So, you've increased that weight and then all of a sudden you can't lift it because you didn't allow for that recovery. So if you did take some recovery, reapproached it, you could probably build back up even stronger. And that's the whole idea behind the general adaptation syndrome. Progressively getting stronger with rest periods.
We're just going to go through these real quick, and we'll make this presentation available so you can actually spend some time looking at these. But if we kind of talked about phases of a year. So one being sort of the off season, and two being pre-season, so which would probably be now through like May, for example, and three would be in season. So what are you doing in between races? So I'll just kind of walk through the bike example. So, and kind of going back to general adaptation syndrome, and also that principle of specificity. So as we're further away from the race, so during the off season, we don't have to do a lot of race-specific training, so we can, it's a great time to do that cross-country skiing or snowshoeing, if you get the snow, of course, or doing some non-specific stuff. So an example workout in the off season, might be 1 to 2 hours easy on the bike. Maybe do some pickups, which are just quick, high, spinning, and maybe you work on some drills. So drills are always a great opportunity to focus on one aspect of a pedal stroke or swim stroke, or part of your run. As you get into the 2, which is the early season, which is probably now through May, the length, the volume comes up, so going 2 to 3 hours. So again, this is a half Ironman athlete, and tempo. So it's starting to get more specific. So tempo would be a moderately hard effort. So that's more like a race-like effort versus an easy to moderate effort like you did in the preseason. And then finally 3, so in season, so May through August for Krista's example. So we're doing the volume's about the same, 2 to 3 hours, but we're doing some harder workouts. So threshold, so lactate threshold would be a pace that she might be able to maintain for 30 to 60 minutes. So really hard effort. So working in some harder intervals, so getting her body used to racing at a higher intensity.
Yeah, and keeping in mind these different periods, just to improve your doing those single leg drills, or like David mentioned earlier, we got some swim lessons. Working on those drills is key, because you may want to write this down. This is pretty important. There are 3 ways you can get faster. One of them's improving your VO2 max, which is the amount of oxygen that you can process at a maximal effort. So also threshold, increasing your threshold. So the ability to sustain an effort as hard as you can for about an hour. And then finally, it's economy. And economy is the way you move your body, how efficient. So if you're more economical on the bike, in the water, on the run, so doing these drills is key. I had a conversation with someone earlier, and they were just trying to get in the volume. It's their first half Ironman, so they try to get in the water and just see how long they can swim and improve that over time. And we discussed how improving the economy in the water is actually going to help your overall fitness even more than just trying to sludge through and get through it. So keep that in mind. Different periods, doing your intervals to improve your threshold will actually help that too. Don't miss those specifics in the workouts.
Okay. So just for the interest of time, I'm not going to go through these, but again, we'll make this presentation available. So some run examples of how your run workouts might change from each period, and same thing with strength. And I don't know, you want to just say something quickly about strength?
Yeah, strength training will help you improve your economy. So your ability to sustain your pedal stroke, your foot strike when you're running, that musculature, if it's stronger, it's going to support those joints better. You're going to prevent injury, increase your bone mineral density, increase your metabolic rate, boost testosterone. So for basically preventing injury, slowing down the aging process, and improving your economy, the strength training portion is so important, and that's something a lot of triathletes just kind of don't do because it takes a lot of extra time. So we've split up specific exercises into phases, so these actually line up with, sort of the intensity and volume of training throughout the year. And we do have videos for a lot of these exercises on ENDURANCEWORKS and School of Tri.
So again, some general guidelines. So 1 event per month. It's a good rule of thumb. I mean, Chris's example. She did two events in July, but I think it's sort of, if you're doing too much racing, that's all you're doing, and you're basically beating your body up pretty hard, and you got to have some time in between to kind of to train and build your fitness. Prioritize events. And by this I mean, it's not to say that you should just, quote, make a C race is like, I won't even train for it. What this means is just figure out, okay, what's, where's the focus of your training, and if you do other stuff along the way, realize, okay, I'm not going to be fully recovered, I'm not going to be, fully trained for this event, but, I can still go out and have a good event. And it helps too if conflicts come up, if work or personal stuff, it helps to say, okay, this is not that important. I can let this go. Shorter events leading up to longer events. Again, with Chris is doing her half barbed race, half Ironman distance in July, so she's doing a sprint triathlon, she's doing a half marathon, and she's doing an international prior to that. So those are all leading up to that. Krista talked about importance of recovery. So recovery doesn't mean, do nothing, sit on, your butt all day. It does mean, just kind of back off the intensity, back off the volume a little bit. And it may mean, taking an extra day off as well.
Yeah, those recovery periods are good opportunities to do some field testing to see where you are. So I like to use those cycles like every 4 weeks at the end, almost like a race where we're just testing things out, whether it's a time trial on the bike or in the water or just maybe a 5K or a, just run assessment.
And finally, the last comment, somewhat subjective, but 4 to 8 like sessions. So if you're trying to, build your run speed, for example, when you're going to the track, you're not going to go once and get faster. It's going to take 4 to 8, like sessions. So if you're working on a specific intensity, it's going to take some time for your body to adapt to that. So, what this means is, if you're doing, race pace efforts, really in just a few short weeks, you can actually increase your fitness quite a bit, but you're not going to be able to do it overnight.
Yeah, consecutive is key there. So if you miss a week or two, you might have to start over on that cycle of training. Maybe not completely over, but to get that adaptation. In theory, it takes about 4 weeks to push up your threshold, so you can make some pretty big improvements in a month's time if you do them consecutively.
So this is sort of diving down a little bit into the weeds. And I think of, going back to sort of the 5 deadly sins of things people do wrong, and one of them is just not being consistent. So one of the, consistency from week to week is key. So if you can kind of come up with a schedule that works for you, and here's just an example schedule: Monday, through Sunday, swim, bike, run. There might be strength or stretching on here as well, but for the simplicity's sake, I'm just going to say, okay, my goal is to do 3 swims, 3 bikes, and 3 runs plus a short break. So this is what my schedule works for my schedule, because I know on Tuesdays and Thursdays, for example, for the swim, there's a master's class that I can go to, so I have other people to swim with. Friday, I just go swim on my own, and so on. So Mondays tend to be the day off for most people. If not Mondays, then usually it's like a Sunday or maybe even a Saturday. And I think again, having it something consistent from week to week, you can put it in your schedule. You kind of block off your time around that. There's nothing worse than getting to the end of the day, you're like, oh crap, I just don't have time to work out, or I'm too tired. But kind of putting this stuff in your schedule, like for me, if I'm doing yoga Wednesday mornings, I put it into my calendar, so every morning, every Wednesday 7:15 to 8:15 it shows up, and so then I know it's there, and I schedule other stuff around with it. The other thing you can notice, to the extent possible, we try and spread things out during the day or during the week. So rather than doing bikes all in the back-to-back days, so there's Friday and Saturday back-to-back, but the other days on Wednesday. So kind of spread it out as much as you can, and it can be hard to do just because of schedules and work and other stuff you have going on. And finally, the last comment, the last bullet. We do a lot of training programs, and Krista does a lot of coaching clients. Rarely, I mean, even myself, when I was really heavily committed and focused on Ironman racing and training, it is rarely did I ever get in all the workouts in a given week. So something came up, work, personal stuff. The dog had to go to the vet, so that's okay. It's just really give yourself some latitude. So aim for that consistency, but also realize that you may not get everything in every week, all the time.
Yeah, and I like using the 75 to 85% rule. I mean, I don't think I've ever gotten 100% of a weekend, but it's important for you to listen to your body as well. Be consistent, but if you're run down, if you have some good data that shows you that, okay, I'm needing a little bit more recovery, then you can adapt that program or work with your coach on that. So it is important to remember not every plan is perfect. It can't be perfect. The perfect plan is, sort of mapping it out specifically for you and making those adaptations as needed.
And there you go. So now you're on the path to your success. So that concludes the formal presentation of our webinar tonight. If you do have questions, please use the chat window it should be on the meeting dashboard on the left side of your screen. If you click on the little triangle, it will open up. Like I said, I'll post this up at ENDURANCEWORKS.net under resources, and I'll send out an email to everybody in the next day or two with the link. We do have a couple more webinars coming up the end of this month. It's one of our most popular, how do you train for your first full or half Ironman distance? And really, this is sort of a lessons learned from, for me, like 15 years of racing and Krista's experiences as well. But really, what are the things to avoid doing, as well as the good things to do. And then, the second one in early March, how to create a nutrition and hydration plan for triathlon. Probably one of the most understated things that we all should have, especially if we're trying to be competitive. As you get into longer and longer events, or you just want to, you're trying to get faster and faster, nutrition and hydration becomes so critical in terms of having enough energy and not upsetting your stomach, so not getting sick like I did for quite a few races until I've kind of figured out, okay, I'm taking in too much. So what is a plan? What are some guidelines you can use to start with, and how do you come up with your own specific plan? So first question, So thank you for the questions, and we'll run through them. And then before I forget, please, don't hesitate to contact us with any questions about these. And we do these every year, and a lot of time we'll come back to the same topics, but we end up redoing the presentations most of the time, anyways, because we're trying to figure out, okay, what's more relevant, what's interesting, as we obviously work with new clients and stuff. So we do take if you have ideas for topics, we'll take them as well. So first question for Peter: how do you improve your VO2 max, and how do you measure?
So the best answer for that is to improve VO2 max is to do intervals that tax that system, and those intervals range from about 3 to 4 minutes, and you're going as hard as you can for that period of time and taking long recoveries. So after repeated efforts at 3 to 4 minutes, maximal effort for that 3 to 4 minutes, taking those recoveries, that would tax the maximal, your ability to utilize oxygen at that maximal point. But the other thing about VO2 max is that you can improve it also by improving other energy systems, such as your aerobic system, so developing that base training and sort of thinking it as a stair step. So as you become more efficient with your endurance and your base building, some of those easier, longer efforts, your body starts to learn to utilize fat as fuel and oxygen efficiently. And then as you start to, improve or add in the intervals where you're doing some tempo efforts, maybe they're, longer 10-minute efforts, threshold efforts where you're pushing even 20, 30 minutes at a time, but building those in, integrating those, and then gradually starting to integrate some of that high-end VO2 max effort. So you're sort of like stacking up that fitness, and VO2 max intervals, when you're ready for them, you can really top off, some of those improvements. But again, I've measured VO2 max for years with a metabolic cart and had athletes come back from year to year, and just because they've done a lot of training in one year, they'll come back and measure higher even in their off season compared to the prior year. So it sort of builds over time as well.
Yep, and there's also a genetic component as well. So Kelly asked a question: new to the sport, but have my first half Irons scheduled for Raleigh May 31st. Is it a bad idea to do a sprint 2 weeks prior? I actually like that. I like the idea of doing a sprint or an international about 2 weeks prior. So it's sort of a great, again, you get that race practice. You get in a high intensity workout because you're racing, but it's not too long that it's not going to break your body down like if you were doing another half or something like that.
Yeah, I think for me personally, I would try to do one further out if it wasn't something I was, just totally sold on. I think the sprint distance versus the Olympic distance for me would be better prior to a half. If you've never done a half before, you may want to consider a little bit more recovery time. It really depends on the individual. So for example, David does really well with that. It kind of tunes him up and prepares him, and is a great part of his training. For me personally, I would need a little bit more rest. Some of my clients, same thing. They could, do it a couple weeks before. Some may not want to do it. So I think sprint is probably safer if you go 2 weeks prior if you've never done that before, a half before.
Oh, you're welcome. And any other questions, even if you want to go beyond this topic? And it's interesting to know, like Chris and I both sort of gave different answers. So there's a lot of science, but there's also a lot of art and kind of what works best for you. And and the good news and bad news is it does take some trial and error. So if you say, okay, I'm going to be in this sport for a while, I always looked at triathlon, and especially as you got into longer distances, sort of this this big jigsaw puzzle, and there's all these pieces, and one piece is nutrition, another piece is pacing, and there's all kinds of training pieces, and what do I wear? Do I wear a long sleeve wetsuit, a sleeveless wetsuit? So all these little pieces to think about, and it, especially as you're new to the sport, it is overwhelming. I look at it now, I'm like, wow, I can't believe I got through all that, but so it's okay. I mean, you're going to make mistakes, and but as you go, you'll figure things out as well. And that's sort of, in my mind, that was always the challenge of it: is how do I get just a little bit better at just one aspect of it.
Yeah, I like what David said, because you're integrating science with real life and how you respond, and we really can't explain everything with science. So I think as long as you start, I've had people tell me for years, like, you need to run 5 days a week and do this much to improve, and I just did a half marathon and PR'd by 2 minutes with 3 days a week of running and less volume than I've ever done. So for my body, what works for me may not work as well for somebody else, and vice versa. And it's just important to kind of learn that about yourself. And when somebody says, this is what works, this is, the Bible, this is what it is, it's really, it's just a little bit maybe of science that we've proved, but there's that other aspect of how do you respond as an individual.
Yep. Okay, Katie had a question. How do you compare time on the trainer to time on the road? Yeah, so I admittedly I hate the treadmill, and I hate the trainer almost as much. So I like the 20 to 25% reduction for riding on the trainer when not on the road. So that's sort of the rule of thumb I've heard and used, because you're not stopping on the trainer. It's more continuous. I do like trainers and treadmills for interval type work, because you can really control the environment. Krista, you want to?
Yeah, there's a love-hate relationship for me, because I feel like you get a lot of good efficient work on the trainer, and although it can be boring, you don't get the scenery, you can outdoors you may not get as efficient work on your intervals and just pushing a particular wattage for a certain period of time. So I think it's actually good to do some specific trainer workouts, even if it's not winter time. You get very efficient training.
Yeah, and I just remember when I used to live in Reston, Virginia, Northern Virginia, and there wasn't a lot of places you could go and just ride. There's always stop signs, and even getting on the trail, there's people and traffic lights, so it's really hard to get interrupted riding. So in that case, sometimes it was better just to get on the trainer. Here, a little bit better in Boulder, because once you get away from the city, there's a lot more open roads where you can just make a bunch of right turns and technically never stop. So a lot of it may depend, and especially this time of year too, with the weather being depending on where you live, the trainer may be a good option. But I think one of the things that's helped me get through the workouts is watching a series show. Like years ago I used to watch Lost. Now I probably watch like Walking Dead, or something that's like 45 minutes. So you can watch a couple episodes, and then you want to come back and see the next episode, so it kind of motivates you to get back on the trainer.
Yeah, and you can just reduce. Like I will typically say in the wintertime, if you can't go outside and ride 2.5 hours, then 2 hours on the trainer is sufficient, because you're getting that much more of an efficient ride. You're not coasting as much, and so forth. So there is a decrease in volume. I typically do with that. Maybe it's 25% or a portion. And if you're doing long rides and it's really cold and you want to do part of the ride outside and part of it on the trainer, that's one of the things I did leading up to Ironman China one year, and it kind of helped me because it was so cold outside. I got some outside, some inside.
Good question. Terry has another good question. What is the best way to incorporate strength / weight training during or when in season?
So what I like to do in season is split workouts up, because I find that a lot of athletes sometimes don't even have an hour to be in the gym. They might do a swim and then have 30 minutes before or after, or 15 minutes even. So what I do is figure out, first of all, if somebody has any kind of injuries, things like that, and try to incorporate those particular exercise. Maybe their glutes aren't firing, or their hip flexors are tight. They need some work on their middle back or deep core abdominal muscles. So I'll pick maybe 5 different exercises and have them do a 15-minute routine, before or after a swim or a bike ride, whatever's more convenient to that schedule. And if I come up with a full body routine and I split up a 60-minute workout into 3 segments, so 3 20-minute segments where some of it's focused on that core with no equipment, the other portion maybe a little bit of strength work, maintenance, and then some maybe movements where we're using a band and doing some crab walks for the glutes or the calf raises. So I'd have that split up and say part 1, part 2, part 3, and throughout the week, if someone's traveling and part 1 is easier, they might be able to integrate that twice. One day it might be just the weight in the supplementary section. So I like to be able to split that up in season so it's more manageable. And the other thing I think people do well with are classes. Classes where you're doing Pilates or maybe even a yoga class once a week, just to kind of keep some stability work with planks and opening exercises to keep things stretched and flexible. So I kind of vary it for the individual, but I think splitting it up into something manageable or doing a class that you'd be likely to go to is a good way to do that in-season integration.
Yeah, and one thing I like to do is, like, when I go to the swim, like, I'll lift after I swim just because it's convenient, and then if I'm swimming, I'm using my upper body, and then I lift afterwards. So if I lift before, sometimes my swimming will suffer because I'm going to just be tired. But that's just another consideration too. Is just what are your other workouts? If you're doing like a long ride or long run, it's probably not a good day to lift before